The glass-walled boardroom of Sterling Aviation Global sat high above the freezing gray waters of Puget Sound, looking more like a pristine ice sculpture than a place of business. Outside, a bitter Seattle sleet hammered against the reinforced windows. Inside, the atmosphere was even colder. A dozen senior executives and private equity investors sat around a polished ebony table, their eyes fixed on the woman at the head. Vivian Sterling, the 29-year-old chief executive of the aerospace logistics empire, stood with perfect, rigid posture. Her tailored charcoal suit was immaculate, her dark hair swept up in a flawless chignon, and her expression was entirely devoid of warmth. In front of her lay a scattering of high-resolution diagnostic photographs showing microscopic fractures in titanium cabin brackets. It was a failure that threatened a multi-million-dollar contract, and Vivian wanted blood. At the far end of the room stood Garrett Vance. At 31, Garrett possessed a quiet, broad-shouldered masculinity that seemed entirely out of place among the smooth-talking executives. His jaw was dusted with a light shadow of stubble, his dark blue chambray shirt was faded at the cuffs, and his eyes carried the deep, unbothered stillness of a man who had faced far worse storms than a corporate board. For 5 years, he had worked as the night shift logistics supervisor at the company's primary airstrip hangar, maintaining a spotless record while keeping his head down. Vivian did not offer him a seat. She didn't even look him in the eye as she gestured coldly to the photos. She demanded to know why the latest batch of structural components for Vanguard Jet Holdings had failed stress testing. Garrett did not flinch. He opened a thick, weathered manila folder, the only paper in a room full of tablets, and spoke in a low, grounded baritone. He explained that the issue wasn't the hangar's quality control. The fractures were occurring because the new discount alloy supplier, handpicked by the corporate purchasing division to cut costs, couldn't handle rapid thermal cycles. He had the metallurgical readout, the transit telemetry, and a detailed 3-page solution that would stabilize the supply chain without delaying the project. Before he could finish his third sentence, Vivian cut him off with a sharp, dismissive wave of her hand. She stated that she didn't hire warehouse labor to rewrite corporate supply chain strategy. She needed absolute accountability to present to the Vanguard investors, not a list of defensive excuses from a supervisor who routinely logged off at exactly 4:30 in the afternoon. The room remained deathly silent. No one dared to defend him. Then, the heavy glass door of the boardroom clicked open. A little girl stood in the doorway, shivering slightly. It was Chloe Vance, Garrett's 7-year-old daughter. She had her father's striking green eyes and wore a faded yellow raincoat that was a size too small. In her arms, she hugged a worn plush sea otter named Barnaby, its stitching coming loose at the tail. The local elementary school had closed early due to a flash freeze on the roads, and the security guard downstairs, who knew Garrett's situation, had quietly let her up. Chloe stood frozen under the harsh fluorescent lights, looking at the intimidating adults before locking her eyes onto her father. Vivian's gaze snapped from the child to Garrett, her expression hardening into profound disgust. She remarked aloud to the room that this was precisely the lack of focus she was talking about. She stated that Sterling Aviation was an elite global entity, not a daycare facility, and that leaders who prioritized their domestic complications over executive execution were a liability the company could no longer afford. She looked directly at Garrett, her voice dropping to a freezing whisper. She told him he was finished, effective immediately, and ordered him to clear his locker before the top of the hour. The executives shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. Garrett stood perfectly still for 3 long seconds. He didn't argue, he didn't plead. He slowly closed his manila folder, tucked it under his arm, and walked the entire length of the boardroom. The heavy thud of his work boots echoed against the polished floor. When he reached the door, he knelt down in front of Chloe. He gently adjusted the hood of her small raincoat, brushed a stray strand of dark hair from her face, and took the plush sea otter from her trembling hands to tuck it securely into her backpack. He gave her a reassuring, warm smile that completely erased the tension in her small frame. He stood up, took his daughter's hand, and walked out into the corridor, without looking back at Vivian. Vivian watched the glass door swing shut, convinced she had just eliminated a weak link from her corporate chain. She had no way of knowing that 5 years ago, before his wife had passed away, Garrett Vance had been the chief logistics officer and elite structural engineer for the United States Navy's Advanced Aviation Division. She had no idea she had just exiled the only man capable of keeping her family's empire from crashing into the ground. The heater in Garrett's beat-up Ford F-150 hummed a low, sputtering tune as the vehicle crawled through the thick traffic bordering the industrial shipping docks. The windshield wipers swept rhythmically against the freezing sleet. In the passenger seat, Chloe sat wrapped in her oversized yellow raincoat, her small fingers tightly gripping Barnaby the otter. She looked out the side window for a long time, watching the gray fog roll off the water, before her voice broke the silence. "Daddy?" Garrett turned his gaze from the brake lights ahead, his expression softening instantly. "Yeah? Bug? Did that lady yell at you because of me?" Her voice was small, laced with a heavy layer of guilt that no 7-year-old should ever have to carry. "If I hadn't come upstairs, would you still have your job?" Garrett pulled the truck into a vacant loading lane and brought it to a gentle stop. He turned completely toward her, his large, calloused hand resting gently on her shoulder. The calm strength radiating from him seemed to instantly push the cold world outside away, creating a safe harbor inside the cramped cabin. "Hey, look at me," he said, his voice a steady, grounding anchor. Chloe looked up, her green eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "That lady didn't yell because of you, and you are the best part of my day. Every single day. I lost that job because the people in that building forgot how to listen to the truth. It has nothing to do with you coming up those stairs. Understand?" Chloe studied his face, looking for any trace of fear or anger. Finding only absolute certainty, she let out a small breath and nodded, leaning her head against his arm. "Okay. Are we going to be okay?" "We are always going to be okay," Garrett murmured, squeezing her shoulder gently. "I promise." Back on the 18th floor of the Sterling Aviation headquarters, the temperature felt like it had dropped even lower. Vivian stood in her private office, staring out at the foggy harbor. On her massive mahogany desk lay the weathered manila folder Garrett had left behind. She hadn't thrown it away yet, though she told herself it was purely for legal documentation in case of a wrongful termination suit. The door opened, and Preston Hayes, the senior director of global procurement, stepped in. Preston was 35, dressed in a sharp, bespoke suit, with a slick smile that had been engineered for investor meetings. He was the executive who had personally brokered the deal with the new metal supplier, Alaris Refineries, promising a massive reduction in quarterly production costs. "Vivian," Preston said, tossing a revised slide deck onto her desk. "The Vanguard situation is completely handled. We've sidelined the hangar supervisor's alarmist reports. I've already scheduled a press release emphasizing our commitment to next-generation fiscal efficiency." Vivienne turned slowly, her eyes narrowing. "The supervisor Vance wasn't talking about efficiency, Preston. He was talking about microscopic fractures in the primary cabin brackets. Did you actually review his metallurgical data?" Preston laughed softly, a condescending sound that echoed off the glass walls. "He's a night shift logistics guy, Vivian. He moves crates and signs manifests. He probably read a blog post about titanium alloys and wanted to feel important. The Alaris materials are certified by a regional testing lab. We are perfectly fine." Vivienne didn't look convinced. Throughout her entire life, her father had hammered one rule into her mind: never ignore the man who touches the iron. She looked down at the faded folder. Something about the way Garrett had spoken, the absolute lack of panic, the precise structural vocabulary didn't match the resume of a simple warehouse worker. After Preston left, Vivian sat at her desk and pulled up the internal human resources database. She typed in Garrett Vance. The digital file that appeared was shockingly sparse. It listed his employment history at Sterling Aviation for the past 5 years. Night shift supervisor, grade 3. Perfect attendance, 0 disciplinary actions. But when she scrolled up to his background history before joining the company, the screen suddenly blinked with an encrypted lock symbol. Instead of a standard employment history, there was a single, bold, red stamp. Department of Defense, Strategic Aviation Division. Records restricted. Vivian frowned, her heart skipping a beat. A standard logistics manager didn't have classified military records. She leaned forward, typing in an administrative override code that only the chief executive possessed. The system whirred, processing for nearly 30 seconds before displaying a heavily redacted document. Most of the text was blacked out, but fragments remained visible. Commander, U.S. Navy. Fleet Readiness Center. Chief Structural Architect, Advanced Flight Dynamics. There was a specific commendation medal mentioned, signed by a 4-star admiral, for extraordinary engineering ingenuity under catastrophic conditions during the emergency stabilization of an active military transport airfield. Vivian's breath caught in her throat. The man she had just publicly humiliated and fired in front of her entire executive board wasn't an unambitious, clock-punching warehouse worker. He was an aviation legend, a top-tier aerospace genius who had been quietly managing her loading docks for pennies. Why would a man like that hide in a midnight warehouse shift? Before she could process the shock, her private line began to ring violently. The caller ID showed the operations center at their primary testing facility at Emerald Crest Airfield. She snatched the receiver up. Sterling. The voice on the other end was frantic, nearly unintelligible over the sound of blaring sirens in the background. Miss Sterling, we have a catastrophic structural emergency at Hangar 9. The Vanguard prototype transport jet. We were conducting the high-pressure cabin stress test. The primary brackets just sheared completely through. The main fuselage is warping under immense pressure, and the automated release valve is jammed. The whole rig is buckling, and 3 technicians are trapped inside the observation bay. The flashing amber emergency lights cut through the thick gloom of Hangar 9 at Emerald Crest Airfield, painting the massive space in a jarring, rhythmic blood red. Alarms wailed, a high-pitched mechanical shriek that echoed off the high corrugated steel ceilings. On the hangar floor, total chaos had taken hold. Fire crews in heavy reflective gear stood at a distance, their hands resting uselessly on their equipment. The massive Vanguard prototype transport jet hung suspended in its heavy steel testing cradle, but it was horrifyingly twisted. The primary support brackets had sheared completely, and the multi-ton fuselage was groaning, bending downward like a wounded animal. Vivian Sterling burst through the side doors, her expensive wool coat instantly soaked by the freezing rain blowing in from the tarmac. Her perfect hair was coming undone, strands whipping across her pale, terrified face. For the first time in her life, the absolute control she maintained over her world was completely gone. Her hands shook violently as she grabbed the jacket of Marcus Thorne, the frantic hangar facility manager. "Why haven't you released the pressure?" Vivian shouted over the roar of the sirens. "Get those men out of the observation capsule." Marcus, a hardened veteran of 30 years on the airfield, looked completely helpless. "The automated bleed valves are totally jammed, Miss Sterling. The low-cost alloy warped so fast under the pressure test that it bent the manual backup rod. The main fuselage is carrying over 40,000 pounds of trapped pneumatic force. If that hull snaps, the entire engine block is going to drop right through the glass of the observation bay. The structural integrity is down to less than 12%. A few feet away, Preston Hayes was sweating through his tailored suit, frantically pacing while staring at a tablet screen. "We need to evacuate the entire sector," Preston stammered, his voice cracking with fear. "If that pressure tank blows, the shrapnel will tear through the whole facility. We need to cut our losses and pull everyone back." "There are 3 technicians trapped under that plane, Preston," Vivian screamed, turning on him. "We can't just walk away." "But the engineering team says it's a mathematical impossibility to clear the lock without exploding the secondary tank," Preston yelled back, backing away from the groaning aircraft. "No one knows the internal routing of this specific prototype layout." Vivian's mind raced, a cold, suffocating dread filling her chest. No one knows the routing. Suddenly, the redacted military file flashed in her mind. Chief Structural Architect. Extraordinary engineering ingenuity under catastrophic conditions. She snatched her phone from her pocket, her fingers trembling so badly she nearly dropped it onto the wet concrete. She bypassed her corporate directory and dialed the personal number listed on Garrett Vance's termination paperwork. 4 miles away, inside the warm, dimly lit interior of the Anchor Line Grill, the atmosphere was quiet. The small neighborhood diner smelled of brewed coffee and maple syrup. Garrett sat at a corner booth, calmly watching Chloe use a green crayon to color a picture of a sailboat on the back of the children's menu. Barnaby the otter sat propped up against the napkin holder. Garrett's phone buzzed violently on the laminate table. He looked at the unknown corporate number, his expression remaining perfectly unreadable. He slid his thumb across the screen and brought the phone to his ear. He didn't say a word. "Garrett, please Garrett, don't hang up." Vivian's voice came crashing through the speaker. The cold, arrogant billionaire CEO was completely gone. In her place was a desperate woman on the verge of tears. "I am at Hangar 9. The Vanguard prototype is collapsing. The alloy warped, the manual pressure bleed is jammed, and 3 of our people are locked inside the capsule directly beneath the engine mount. The engineers say it's going to blow. Please. I know what you did in the Navy. I know who you are. I need your help." Garrett listened to the screaming sirens bleeding through the phone line. He looked down at his daughter, who had stopped coloring and was looking up at him with her large, perceptive green eyes. He didn't boast. He didn't bring up the insults she had hurled at him in the boardroom hours prior. "Did you try the secondary hydraulic bypass behind the wheel well?" Garrett asked, his baritone voice instantly cutting through her panic like a steady beam of light. "Marcus tried." Vivian sobbed, her voice trembling. "The shifting weight warped the housing. It won't budge. They say it's a lost cause." Garrett slid his chair back and stood up. His large frame instantly commands respect even in the empty diner. "I'm 5 minutes away. Tell your security to clear the main gate." When the faded Ford F-150 roared up to the security perimeter of Emerald Crest Airfield, the guards didn't even ask for identification. They threw the gates open wide. Garrett parked right outside the heavy bay doors of Hangar 9. He stepped out into the freezing sleet, but he didn't enter alone. He reached into the passenger side and lifted Chloe out, shielding her under his large arm. He wasn't going to leave his daughter alone in a dark truck in the middle of a crisis. As Garrett walked into the flashing red chaos of the hangar, holding Chloe's hand, a sudden, heavy silence fell over the gathered crowd of mechanics and executives. The very man they had watched get escorted out of the corporate office like a dog was walking back onto the floor, his head held high, his steps deliberate and unhurried. Preston Hayes spotted him and immediately ran forward, pointing an angry, trembling finger. "What is he doing here? This is an active disaster zone. You can't bring a child in here, Vance. Get out before I have security." "Preston, shut your mouth," Vivian commanded, stepping past him. Her boots splashed through the puddles on the concrete. She stopped 3 feet from Garrett, her eyes wide, staring at him as if he were a ghost. Her hands were still shaking, but the moment she looked into his calm, steady green eyes, she felt an inexplicable wave of safety wash over her. The massive transport jet gave a terrifying metallic screech, dropping another 3 inches. Shards of structural carbon fiber rained down onto the glass capsule below, where the 3 trapped technicians were screaming, pressing their hands against the reinforced glass. Chloe gasped, pulling tightly on Garrett's jeans. The loud, violent groan of the dying aircraft was terrifying to a 7-year-old. Garrett immediately dropped to one knee, completely turning his back on the multi-million-dollar disaster, ignoring the screaming sirens, the executives, and the imminent danger. He took Chloe's small face in his large, warm hands. "Hey," Garrett said softly, his voice incredibly gentle, completely unaffected by the panic around them. "Look right here at me, Chloe. You see Sarah from the front reception desk over there?" He pointed to a kind-faced woman standing near the safety exit. Chloe nodded, her lower lip trembling. "I want you to go stand with her. Hold Barnaby tight. Close your eyes and count to 60. Can you do that for me?" Chloe looked at the groaning, twisted mountain of metal above, then back into her father's steady eyes. The sheer contrast between the hysterical billionaire CEO and this broke single father who provided absolute emotional security in the middle of a war zone was staggering. "I can do it, Daddy," Chloe whispered, hugging her plush otter tight. Garrett kissed her forehead, stood up, and watched her walk safely over to the receptionist. The moment she was out of the line of fire, the warmth left Garrett's face. He turned toward the collapsing prototype jet, his eyes narrowing as he analyzed the structural failure with the laser-focused precision of a military legend. "Give me a heavy manual lever, a portable thermal cutter, and 5 minutes," Garrett said, his quiet masculinity settling over the terrified crowd like a direct order. "And if anyone interferes, I'll drop them myself." Marcus Thorne didn't hesitate. He scrambled toward the heavy equipment lockers at the back of the hangar, his boots sliding on the slick, oil-stained concrete. He ripped a massive 6-foot steel pry bar from the emergency rack and grabbed a portable, battery-powered thermal cutter, its oxygen cylinders clanking violently against the frame. He sprinted back, his breath ragged in the freezing air, and thrust the tools into Garrett's hands. Preston Hayes stepped forward, his face flushed a panicked bright crimson as he tried to intercept them. He waved his arms frantically, his voice cracking into a high pitch that sounded completely pathetic against the roaring sirens. He screamed that this was a massive violation of federal safety protocols and corporate insurance mandates. He shouted that if Garrett touched that fuselage with a live thermal blade, the entire liability for the prototype's destruction would fall squarely on Sterling Aviation, and that he would personally see to it that criminal charges were filed. Vivian turned on him so fast her coat whipped through the damp air. The cold, unyielding mask of the billionaire chief executive completely shattered, exposing a raw, furious desperation. She told Preston to shut his mouth or she would personally throw him out into the freezing sleet herself. She pointed at the trap technicians and told him that if he valued his corporate career over human lives, he could leave the airfield immediately. Preston flinched, backing away into the shadows of the utility trucks, his useless tablet clutched tightly against his chest. Garrett ignored the shouting entirely. He took the heavy steel bar in his left hand and ignited the thermal cutter with his right. A fierce, brilliant blue flame hissed to life, casting harsh, jagged shadows across his determined face. Without a single trace of hesitation, he stepped directly into the lethal shadow of the groaning, twisting transport jet. The 20-ton fuselage gave another terrifying metallic shriek. A stream of pressurized hydraulic fluid burst from a ruptured line overhead, spraying like black oil across the concrete. The three technicians inside the glass observation capsule were screaming now, pounding their fists against the reinforced glass as the massive engine block directly above them began to sag, the structural frame bending like cheap plastic. From the edge of the safety zone, Vivienne watched him go, her hands pressed tightly against her mouth to stop herself from crying out. She was a woman who could command boardrooms, manipulate international markets, and crush competitors with a single memo. Yet right now, standing in the freezing, smoke-filled air of a ruined hangar, she felt completely, utterly helpless. All her wealth, her family name, and her executive power couldn't stop the steel from collapsing. She looked over at the safety exit. Chloe was standing perfectly still beside Sarah, the receptionist. The little girl had her eyes squeezed tightly shut, her small arms wrapped around her plush sea otter, her lips moving silently as she counted to 60, just like her father had asked. She wasn't crying. She wasn't panicking. She trusted her father so completely that even in the middle of a screaming industrial nightmare, she felt safe. Vivienne felt a sudden, profound wave of shame wash over her. She realized that she had spent her entire life building an empire of glass and numbers, believing that authority could buy security. But true strength wasn't a title on an office door. True strength was the quiet, masculine gravity of the man standing beneath a falling airplane, providing absolute safety to his child without even trying. Garrett hoisted the heavy pry bar, analyzing the warp structure in a single sweeping glance. He didn't need a diagnostic computer or a team of junior engineers. He saw exactly where the cheap Alaris alloy had buckled under the thermal stress. The pressure wasn't locked in the primary bleed lines. It had migrated and jammed the secondary emergency gate behind the main wheel well housing. It was a deadly pneumatic trap. He stepped closer, the heat from the engine bay radiating against his skin. He raised the thermal cutter, the brilliant blue flame slicing into the reinforced locking pin of the main bypass valve. White-hot sparks cascaded over his leather work boots like a waterfall of fire. The smell of burning titanium and scorched rubber filled the air, thick and suffocating. "Garrett! The upper brace is snapping!" Marcus shouted from the safety line, his voice full of terror. "Get out of there!" Garrett didn't move an inch. His hand remained rock-steady as the flame cut through the final fraction of the hardened steel pin. The moment the metal glowed translucent white, he dropped the cutter, shoved the 6-foot steel bar deep into the manual release mechanism, and threw his entire weight against the lever. His muscles strained against his faded shirt, his jaw clenched tight as he fought 40,000 pounds of trapped pneumatic pressure. With a deafening explosive crack that sounded like a heavy artillery shell detonating inside the hangar, the manual pressure gate shattered open. A violent roaring plume of white, superheated steam hissed out of the release vent, blinding everyone in a thick, choking cloud. The automated emergency seals on the observation capsule instantly popped open with a heavy hydraulic hiss. The three trap technicians scrambled out of the hatch, gasping for air and coughing violently, running as fast as their legs could carry them toward the safety exits. The crowd of mechanics erupted into cheers, but the celebration was cut brutally short. The sudden, violent release of the trapped pneumatic force caused a catastrophic weight transfer across the compromised frame. On the opposite side of the aircraft, the remaining Alaris alloy brackets snapped completely like dry twigs. The entire massive engine housing shifted violently sideways, tilting at a horrific angle. A sharp, deafening metallic groan echoed through the space as the primary structural support pillar buckled completely, collapsing inward and cutting off Garrett's only exit route. Vivienne screamed his name as a massive shadow of falling steel descended, and the thick cloud of white steam completely swallowed the bay. The white, superheated steam hung over the center of Hangar 9 like a thick, blinding shroud. For several agonizing seconds, the only sound was the hiss of escaping pressure and the rhythmic, mocking wail of the emergency sirens. The multi-ton fuselage of the Vanguard prototype sat twisted and motionless, a ruined monument of steel and cheap alloy. Vivian Sterling lunged forward, her expensive leather boots splashing through puddles of oil and water. She didn't care about the stains on her clothes, the ruined chignon, or the freezing air. She only knew that the man who had just saved 3 lives was buried somewhere beneath that mountain of collapsing metal. "Garrett," she screamed, her voice cracking, entirely stripped of its usual corporate authority. "Marcus, get the rescue saws! Move! We have to get him out!" Marcus Thorne grabbed her by the arm, pulling her back with a heavy grunt as a secondary sheet of aluminum paneling sheared off the wing and slammed onto the concrete. "Miss Sterling, wait! The structure is still settling. If you go in there blindly, you'll get crushed." "Let go of me!" Vivian fought against his grip, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had spent her entire life managing risks from a safe distance, calculated behind a desk, insulated by wealth. But watching that massive shadow fall over, Garrett had shattered something fundamental inside her. She looked frantically through the smoke, her vision blurring. Near the safety exit, Chloe opened her green eyes. The 60 seconds were up. She looked at the wall of white steam, then down at Barnaby, the otter. Her small hands were trembling violently, and the color had completely drained from her face, but she didn't cry. She stared into the gloom with a fierce, quiet faith that mirrored her father's. She stood her ground, refusing to let the terror of the adults around her break her promise. Suddenly, a deep, metallic thud echoed from beneath the collapsed undercarriage of the aircraft. A heavy steel access hatch, flush with the concrete floor of the hangar, groaned open. A large, grease-stained hand gripped the edge of the frame, and a moment later, Garrett Vance hauled himself out of the maintenance trench. His blue shirt was torn at the shoulder, revealing a stark white scar from his military days, and a thick smear of black carbon grease lined his jaw. He was breathing heavily, but his eyes were completely calm, his posture unbroken. When the corporate office had ordered the old underground utility trenches sealed the previous winter to save on heating costs, Garrett had quietly refused to lock the primary access hatches. He knew the hangar's blueprints better than the architects who drew them. The moment he felt the weight transfer shift above him, his tactical instincts had taken over, and he had dropped into the reinforced concrete creeper slot a split second before the support pillar pancaked. Vivienne stopped breathing. She broke away from Marcus and took 3 hurried steps toward him, her hands trembling. "Garrett, you're alive." Garrett didn't answer her immediately. He wiped a streak of sweat and soot from his forehead with the back of his forearm, his gaze sweeping over the ruined prototype, then over the 3 coughing technicians who were being treated by the airfield medical staff. Satisfied that the immediate danger had passed, he turned his head and locked his eyes onto the safety exit. Chloe was already running. She sprinted across the wet concrete, her yellow raincoat fluttering behind her. Garrett dropped to both knees, opening his arms wide as his daughter slammed into his chest, wrapping her small arms tightly around his neck. 58, 59, 60. Chloe whispered softly into his ear, her voice thick with relief. "I didn't open my eyes until 60, Daddy." "I know, Bug," Garrett murmured, burying his face in her dark hair, his large hands holding her so securely that the ruined hangar around them seemed to vanish. "You did perfect. I told you we were going to be okay." Marcus Thorne walked slowly toward the trench, staring at the collapsed pillar, then at Garrett. The old facility manager's face was white with a sudden, shocking realization. He had spent his entire life around aviation mechanics, and he knew that no standard warehouse supervisor possessed that kind of split-second structural awareness or knew the exact load-bearing failure points of a restricted military-grade transport bay. The creeper slot. Marcus breathed, his voice trembling as he looked at Garrett. "You didn't just stumble into that. You knew exactly which way the fuselage would twist when the bracket snapped. You used the secondary torque lines to predict the collapse." Garrett stood up, lifting Chloe easily into his arms, keeping her tucked safely against his shoulder. "A structure always tells you how it's going to break, Marcus. You just have to know how to listen to the iron." Marcus's jaw dropped. He took a step back, his eyes widening. "Listen to the iron. That's a fleet readiness phrase. Navy experimental salvage operations. Oh my God, you're Commander Vance. You're the chief engineer who stabilized the carrier deck after the missile bay fire in the Gulf." The whisper traveled through the gathered crowd of mechanics like wildfire. The men shifted, staring at the quiet father in the faded flannel shirt with a sudden, profound reverence. The low-wage worker they had seen dismissed and insulted hours ago was an absolute military legend, an aerospace genius whose tactical manuals were still taught at the academy. Preston Hayes stepped out from behind the utility trucks, his face pale but his eyes full of desperate corporate malice. He saw his career flashing before his eyes, and he tried to claw his way back into control. He stammered that it didn't matter who Garrett used to be, shouting that the prototype was completely destroyed, the Vanguard contract was ruined, and it was Garrett's illegal use of a thermal cutter that had caused the final structural collapse. Before Garrett could even blink, Vivian turned on Preston. "Pack your things, Preston," Vivian said, her voice dropping into a freezing, razor-sharp register that silenced the entire hangar. "You are stripped of your title, your equity, and your clearance. You will leave this airfield under security escort, and my legal team will spend the next 5 years ensuring you never touch an aerospace contract again." Preston gasped, his tablet slipping from his fingers and shattering on the concrete. "Vivian, you can't do this!" The board answers to me." Vivian stepped closer to him, her eyes burning with an unyielding fury. "And right now you are a parasite who nearly killed 3 of my men to protect a kickback from a cheap alloy supplier." She pointed to the gates. "Get out of my sight." Preston looked at the stone-faced mechanics closing in around him, realized he had completely lost, and turned, scurrying out into the freezing sleet like a beaten dog. Vivian turned back to Garrett. The silence between them was heavy, filled with the smoke of the ruined plane and the weight of everything she had misunderstood. She took a slow, hesitant breath, her eyes searching his face, desperate to find a way to fix the immense damage she had caused. Before she could speak, the heavy main doors of the hangar groaned open again, and a fleet of black luxury SUVs pulled directly onto the wet concrete floor, their high beams cutting through the lingering steam. The doors opened, and a group of grim-faced executives in tailored overcoats stepped out, led by a tall, imposing, silver-haired man. It was Arthur Vanguard, the billionaire founder of Vanguard Jet Holdings, and he had just arrived to personally audit the disaster. The heavy door of the lead black SUV swung open, and Arthur Vanguard stepped out into the damp, smoke-choked air of Hangar 9. At 62, the billionaire aerospace titan possessed an intimidating aura of absolute authority. Clad in a bespoke charcoal overcoat that remained unbothered by the freezing sleet, his silver hair caught the reflection of the flashing amber lights. His sharp blue eyes swept across the cavernous space, instantly locking onto the ruined, twisted fuselage of his $500 million prototype jet. Behind him, a half-dozen high-ranking Vanguard executives and private security detail moved in a silent, synchronized formation. The remaining Sterling Aviation staff froze. The air grew thick with a collective, suffocating tension. Vivian Sterling swallowed hard, forcing her trembling hands into the pockets of her soaked wool coat. She stepped forward to meet him, trying desperately to salvage a lifetime of corporate training, though her voice lacked its usual icy confidence. "Mr. Vanguard," Vivian began, her breath pluming in the cold air, "I want to personally apologize for this catastrophic incident. We have experienced a severe mechanical failure during the high-pressure cabin stress test. I have already identified the internal source of the oversight, and the executive responsible has been permanently removed from the company." Arthur Vanguard didn't stop walking. He marched straight past her, his polished leather shoes crunching over the shards of carbon fiber scattered across the concrete. He stopped at the edge of the safety perimeter, staring at the collapsed undercarriage and the severed manual pressure gate. "I don't care about your corporate firings, Miss Sterling," Arthur said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that cut through the sound of the distant sirens. "I want to know why my development program is sitting in pieces on a wet floor. By all data models, this hangar should be a smoking crater right now. The pneumatic lock on that fuselage was a lethal trap. Who cleared the pressure?" Marcus Thorne, the hangar facility manager, stepped out of the crowd, his face still pale from the adrenaline. He pointed a steady, reverent hand toward the shadow of the utility trucks. "It wasn't an automated system, Mr. Vanguard," Marcus said, his voice ringing clearly through the quiet hangar. "The backup valves were entirely warped. It was manually cleared by our night shift supervisor, Garrett Vance. He used a thermal cutter and a heavy pry bar to pop the gate, and then he used the secondary torque lines to survive the structural collapse." Arthur Vanguard turned his head sharply. His intense gaze swept across the floor, bypassing the executives, bypassing Vivian, until it landed squarely on Garrett. Garrett was still kneeling on the concrete, his large, powerful frame shielding Chloe, who remained tucked safely under his arm with her plush sea otter. He was calmly wiping a fresh smudge of black grease from his daughter's cheek, completely unbothered by the arrival of the global billionaire. The moment Arthur Vanguard saw Garrett's face beneath the harsh utility lights, the Titan's cold, stoic expression completely shattered. His eyes widened in absolute, stunning disbelief. He blinked twice, taking a slow step forward, completely ignoring his own executive entourage. "Commander Vance?" Arthur's voice breathed out, carrying a tone of such profound, shocking reverence that it echoed off the corrugated steel walls like a physical blow. The entire hangar went deathly still. Vivienne Sterling felt the blood completely drain from her face. She looked from Arthur Vanguard to Garrett, her mind spinning into a chaotic vortex of confusion and sudden realization. Arthur walked right past Vivienne, his eyes locked entirely on the quiet single father. He stopped 3 feet away, his chest heaving slightly. He didn't offer a typical sterile corporate handshake. Instead, the billionaire founder of the world's largest aerospace conglomerate stood perfectly straight and delivered a deep, deeply respectful nod, the kind of honor reserved exclusively for military royalty. "Garrett," Arthur said, his voice rich with genuine emotion. "I haven't seen you since the classified Joint Chiefs briefing at the Pentagon 5 years ago. The entire defense sector thought you vanished off the face of the earth. What in God's name are you doing working a midnight logistics shift in a commercial hangar?" Garrett stood up slowly, lifting Chloe easily into his arms. His quiet masculinity remained entirely unchanged, his green eyes steady and unblinking as he faced the billionaire. "I needed to raise my daughter, Arthur," Garrett replied softly, his deep baritone completely steady. "The fleet didn't leave much room for school pickups. I wanted a quiet place where nobody asked about the past." Arthur looked down at Chloe, his tough expression softening instantly into something remarkably gentle. "And this must be Chloe. Your father is a national treasure, little lady. You should be incredibly proud of him." Chloe nodded solemnly, hugging Barnaby the otter tighter against her chest. "I am. He always fixes everything." Arthur smiled warmly, but when he turned back around to face Vivienne and the remaining Sterling executives, the warmth vanished instantly, replaced by a freezing, terrifying fury. He looked at Vivienne as if she were a child playing with fire. "Miss Sterling," Arthur Vanguard said, his voice dripping with an absolute, unyielding scorn that made the senior board members visibly flinch. "Do you have even the slightest, most remote understanding of who you have running your loading docks? When my engineers were designing the advanced global defense fleet, we hit a structural resonance barrier that nearly destroyed the entire project. The Department of Defense brought in one man to completely rewrite the structural matrix of modern aviation. It was Commander Garrett Vance." Vivienne couldn't speak. Her throat felt completely blocked by a mountain of sudden, crushing shame. She looked at Garrett, the man she had called a liability, the man she claimed couldn't carry a real load because he cared about his daughter, and realized she had been standing in the presence of a giant all along. "But it gets worse, doesn't it, Mr. Vanguard?" Marcus Thorne spoke up from the crowd, his voice filled with an old mechanic's unyielding demand for justice. "Because Commander Vance didn't just save those men tonight. He tried to save this entire project this morning. He brought a complete metallurgical diagnostic folder to the 18th floor, predicting this exact alloy failure. And the executive board threw him out of the building for it." Arthur's sharp blue eyes snapped back to Vivienne, freezing her in place like a laser. "Is this true, Vivienne? You had a warning from the most brilliant structural architect in the Western Hemisphere, and you ignored it?" Vivienne stared at the oil-stained concrete, her lip trembling as the absolute humiliation of her arrogance washed over her in front of her entire workforce. I didn't know his background. You thought he was just an ordinary man." Arthur finished her sentence, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "You evaluated a human being by the dirt on his boots rather than the integrity in his soul. You let your shiny presentations blind you to real, unyielding competence." Arthur turned back to Garrett, his expression shifting instantly into an open, desperate plea. "Garrett, name your terms. Come to Vanguard Jet Holdings. I will hand you the keys to our entire global engineering and development division tomorrow morning. You will answer to no one but me. You can set whatever hours your daughter needs, and I will personally triple whatever meager salary this company was paying you." The entire room held its collective breath, every eye fixed on the quiet single father holding his little girl. The massive power reversal was absolute, and Vivienne Sterling stood completely exposed, waiting for the final blow. Garrett stood in the center of the silent hangar, the weight of Arthur Vanguard's massive offer hanging in the damp air. The mechanics watched, their breath catching, waiting for the single father to seize the ultimate corporate revenge. He could take the job, ruin Sterling Aviation with a single word, and walk away a multimillionaire. Instead, Garrett looked down at Chloe. She was shivering slightly, her small chin resting on his shoulder, her fingers still entwined in the loose thread of Barnaby the otter. The glamour of executive titles and global engineering divisions meant absolutely nothing to the green eyes looking up at him. "I appreciate the offer, Arthur," Garrett said, his low baritone cutting through the silence with absolute calm. "Truly, I do. But my shift ended over an hour ago, and I promised this little girl we'd finish our dinner. Let's look at the development contracts tomorrow morning." Arthur Vanguard didn't look offended. A slow, deeply respectful smile spread across his weathered face. He nodded once, a sharp, clean gesture. "A man who keeps his word to his daughter is the only kind of man I trust with my fleet, Commander. Go feed your girl. My office will call you at 8. As Garrett turned to leave, the hangar erupted. It wasn't a corporate applause. It was the raw, thumping cheers of men who worked with their hands. Mechanics banged heavy wrenches against steel tables, and utility truck drivers honked their horns. They were cheering for the supervisor who had protected them, the military legend who had remained one of them, and the father who put his child above a billionaire's bankroll. Garrett nodded to Marcus Thorne, gave a brief wave to the crew, and walked toward the heavy exit doors. "Garrett, wait." The voice was low, strained, and entirely stripped of the icy armor that usually defined it. Vivian Sterling stepped into his path. The sleek, untouchable CEO who had dominated magazine covers looked incredibly fragile standing under the harsh utility lights. Her tailored suit was damp, her shoulder was smudged with black carbon grease, and her hands were trembling so violently she had to clasp them together to hide it. She looked at Garrett, then her eyes drifted down to Chloe. The little girl didn't look at Vivian with anger or fear anymore. She just leaned against her father's chest, completely serene, wrapped in a blanket of absolute safety that Garrett provided without even trying. Vivian felt a sharp, hollow ache in her chest. For years, she had believed that power was something you wielded like a weapon, that control was achieved by keeping everyone at a freezing distance. She had inherited an international empire, a penthouse overlooking the Sound, and a net worth that made her one of the most powerful women in the country. She had everything, except peace. And here was a man who owned a dented truck, a torn shirt, and a weathered manila folder. Yet he walked through the world with an unshakable, grounding security that money could never buy. "Please," Vivienne whispered, her voice catching in her throat as she stepped closer. The freezing Seattle wind howled through the open bay doors, whipping strands of her dark hair across her face. "Don't leave yet. I need to say it." Garrett stopped. He didn't look at her with malice. His quiet masculinity remained steady, a human anchor in the middle of her collapsing world. He waited, his silence giving her the space to breathe. "I was wrong," Vivian said, her voice trembling as she looked directly into his steady green eyes. An emotional pause stretched between them, heavy and raw. "I stood in that boardroom, and I looked at you, and all I saw was a timeline on a spreadsheet. I thought, because you cared about picking up your daughter, you didn't have the drive to carry a real load. I didn't see the man who was keeping the ceiling from falling on our heads. I am so deeply sorry, Garrett. Not for the contract, not for Vanguard, for what I said to you." A tear slipped down her cheek, cutting a clean path through the soot on her skin. She looked entirely human, her rare vulnerability genuine and exposed. Garrett watched her for a long moment. He saw the exhausting weight she carried, the terror of failing her family's legacy, the isolation of the top floor, the constant, suffocating pressure to be flawless. He took a single step closer. The subtle shift in his posture brought a wave of warmth that seemed to shield her from the freezing air. "My wife, Hannah, used to tell me that the hardest part of building anything is knowing when to stop tightening the bolts," Garrett said softly, his voice incredibly gentle. "If you pull the structure too tight, Vivian, the metal gets brittle. It cracks under the first freeze. People are the same way." Vivian looked up, her breath hitching as his words struck the exact center of her hidden pain. She reached out instinctively, her trembling fingers brushing against the rough fabric of his sleeve before she caught herself. The brief, electric touch hung in the air, a spark of sudden, unexpected chemistry born from raw respect and shared survival. I've spent 3 years tightening every bolt, she whispered, her eyes locked onto his. Then let the pressure out, Garrett replied, a faint, warm smile touching his lips. Before the hull warps. He adjusted Chloe in his arms, his large hand rubbing his daughter's back in a slow, soothing rhythm. He gave Vivian one last steady look. I'll see you in the morning, Miss Sterling. Get out of the cold. He turned and walked through the heavy doors, stepping out into the swirling sleet. Vivian stood perfectly still, watching his broad shoulders disappear into the dark lot. She listened to the distant rumble of his Ford F-150 starting up, the headlights cutting bright beams through the gray Seattle mist. She stood there for a long time, the freezing rain falling on her face, realizing that for the first time in her life, she didn't want to go back to the 18th floor. She wanted to know what it felt like to be safe. The morning sun finally broke through the heavy mantle of gray Seattle clouds, casting a brilliant, blinding sheet of gold across the calm waters of Puget Sound. On the 18th floor of the Sterling Aviation headquarters, the glass walls no longer looked like an ice sculpture. They reflected a new, fragile warmth. In the executive lobby, the atmosphere had transformed entirely. The rigid, silent tension that usually terrified visitors was gone. Sitting at a round mahogany table near the grand reception desk was Chloe Vance. She was sipping hot cocoa from a ceramic mug, completely absorbed in a brand new, premium leather-bound sketch pad. Beside her sat Barnaby the otter, freshly mended with neat, tight stitching along his tail, a quiet midnight favor handled by the company's elite upholstery department on Vivian's direct orders. Vivian Sterling stood a few feet away, watching the little girl. She wore a simple navy blue dress, her hair falling softly around her shoulders instead of pulled into her usual severe chignon. There were light shadows under her eyes, the mark of a woman who had spent the night rewriting her entire corporate philosophy, but her posture was relaxed. The glass elevator chimed, and Garrett Vance stepped out. He wore a clean, dark gray button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, exposing the faded ink of his naval unit tattoo. He possessed the same grounded, unhurried masculinity that had defied the corporate board the day before. Chloe looked up, her green eyes lighting up instantly. "Daddy, look! The receptionist lady gave me hot cocoa, and look at Barnaby's tail. It's stronger than titanium." Garrett smiled, a warm, genuine expression that reached his eyes. He walked over, ruffling her hair gently. "I see that, Bug. Looks like you've been upgraded to first class." Vivienne stepped forward, her hands folded in front of her. She didn't look at Garrett with the cold calculation of a CEO anymore. Her gaze was soft, filled with a deep, vulnerable respect. "She's been the perfect guest. Garrett," Vivian said softly, her voice carrying a rare, gentle warmth. "Arthur Vanguard is waiting for us in the main boardroom. Whenever you're ready." Garrett nodded, turning to Chloe. "Stay right here with Barnaby, okay? I'll be right back." "Okay, Daddy. I'm drawing a picture of our new truck," Chloe said, already lowering her crayon back to the paper. Garrett and Vivienne walked side by side down the long, carpeted corridor toward the glass boardroom. The silence between them wasn't cold. It was thick with an unspoken understanding, the lingering electricity of the night before. Inside the boardroom, Arthur Vanguard sat at the head of the ebony table, surrounded by a mountain of revised legal contracts. The silver-haired Titan looked up, his sharp eyes crinkling into a smile as Garrett entered. "Commander Vance?" Arthur stood, offering a firm, respectful handshake, which Garrett took. "I hope you're ready to sign." My legal team stayed up until 3 in the morning drafting the executive contract for Vanguard's global engineering division. The salary, the equity, the absolute autonomy over research and development, it's all exactly as we discussed. You will be the most powerful engineer in the private defense sector. Vivienne stood near the window, her chest tightening slightly. She knew that the moment Garrett signed that paper, Sterling Aviation would lose him forever. Her family's company would survive the immediate crisis, but the soul of the operation, the unyielding competence Garrett represented, would walk right out the door. She looked away, staring out at the harbor, forcing herself to accept the consequence of her past arrogance. Garrett looked down at the multi-million-dollar contract lying on the table. He didn't pick up the pen. He slid the folder back toward Arthur. "I'm not signing it, Arthur," Garrett said smoothly, his deep baritone completely steady. Arthur Vanguard blinked, completely stunned. "Garrett, if it's the numbers, name your price. I can double the equity." "It's not the numbers," Garrett interrupted gently, leaning his large frame against the back of a leather chair. If I take that job, I'm back in the Pentagon briefing rooms. I'm on flights to Washington 3 times a week. I'm spending my evenings managing global defense budgets instead of braiding my daughter's hair. I left the Navy to be a father. Arthur. I'm not trading her childhood for a bigger corporate office. Vivian snapped her head around, her eyes wide as she stared at him in absolute disbelief. Arthur sighed, a deep sound of immense regret, but he nodded slowly. I understand. A man's family comes first. But what about the Vanguard prototype fleet? I can't trust Sterling Aviation to build these jets if they're going to keep using cheap alloy and cutting corners in the hangars. They won't be, Garrett said, turning his gaze toward Vivian. The intensity in his green eyes made her breath catch. I have a counterproposal. I'm not joining Vanguard. Instead, I'm launching an independent quality assurance firm, Vance Logistics and Structural Integrity. We will operate out of Emerald Crest Airfield. He stepped closer to the table, his quiet authority filling the room. Vance Logistics will have absolute veto power over every material supplier, every engineering blueprint, and every structural component that leaves a Sterling hangar. If my inspectors don't sign off on the iron, the planes don't fly. Arthur, you get my eyes on every square inch of your fleet, and Sterling Aviation gets to keep the contract. Arthur Vanguard looked at Garrett, then at Vivian, a slow, brilliant grin spreading across his face. An independent watchdog run by Commander Vance. It's brilliant. It insulates my liability completely, but that depends entirely on whether Miss Sterling is willing to cede absolute structural control of her company to a former warehouse supervisor. Arthur turned to Vivienne, raising an eyebrow. Vivienne didn't hesitate for a single second. She took a step toward Garrett, her chin lifted, her eyes shining with a fierce, absolute certainty. I accept his terms completely, Vivienne said, her voice ringing clear and strong through the boardroom. In fact, I'll go a step further. Sterling Aviation will completely fund the launch of Vance Logistics. Garrett will have a permanent seat on our executive board, and his authority over our production standards will be absolute. No executive, no director, and no investor will ever be allowed to overrule him. Arthur Vanguard laughed heartily, slamming his hand down on the table. Then we have a deal. Draw up the corporate partnership agreements. Garrett, you've managed to completely restructure 2 global empires before breakfast. An hour later, the contracts were initialed, and the future of the aerospace industry was firmly secured. Arthur Vanguard and his entourage departed via the private elevator, leaving Garrett and Vivian alone in the sprawling boardroom. The silence returned, but it was soft, filled with a profound emotional relief. Vivian walked over to the edge of the glass table, looking out at the sunlit Puget Sound. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly, her voice dropping into a low, intimate register. She didn't look at him, her fingers tracing the edge of the wood. You could have taken Vanguard's money and watched my company slide into bankruptcy, after how I treated you. After what I said, you owed me absolutely nothing. Garrett walked over, stopping just a foot away from her. The broad shadow of his shoulders completely sheltered her from the vastness of the empty room. He looked out at the water, his profile strong and contemplative. I didn't do it for the company, Vivian, Garrett said softly. Vivian turned her head, her breath catching as she met his steady green gaze. Then why did you stay? Because of what you said to me in the hangar last night, Garrett replied, his voice dropping to a low, warm whisper that vibrated right through her chest. You looked at a man covered in grease and soot, and you had the courage to admit you were wrong. It takes a remarkable amount of strength to let the pressure out, Vivian. I've spent 5 years around people who only care about titles and photographs. Last night, I saw a woman who was willing to look at the iron. Vivienne felt a deep, overwhelming warmth flood her chest, a sensation of profound emotional security she hadn't felt since her father was healthy. Her eyes brimmed with tears, but she didn't wipe them away. She let out a small, shaky breath, her hand moving instinctively toward his. This time, she didn't pull back. Her small fingers slid into his large, calloused palm. Garrett closed his hand around hers, his grip firm, warm, and completely grounding. The silent electric chemistry between them was no longer hidden. It was a promise of a new foundation, built not on corporate power, but on raw, unyielding trust. I still have a lot of bolts to loosen, Garrett, she whispered, a small, beautiful smile breaking through her tears. We'll loosen them together, Garrett murmured, squeezing her hand gently. One turn at a time. The door to the boardroom clicked open, and Chloe walked in, holding Barnaby the otter by his newly reinforced tail. She stopped, looking at her father and Vivian holding hands by the window, the bright morning sunlight washing over them. "Are we done with the big meetings, Daddy?" Chloe asked, her green eyes bright with hope. "Can we go get ice cream now?" Garrett looked down at his daughter, then back at Vivian, the warm smile returning to his face. "Yeah, Bug," Garrett said, his voice echoing with absolute peaceful closure. "The meetings are completely finished. We're finally going home." As the three of them walked into the elevator together, Vivienne looked at the quiet single father beside her. She realized that her father had been right all along. The most valuable things in the world were the boring virtues, honesty, reliability, and an unbreakable frame. Vivian Sterling's father had built a legacy on ambition, but she was going to build a life on the iron. And next to Garrett Vance, she knew the structure would never break again.